There was a time, many years ago, when I stood at the window of a small rented room in a forgotten part of Chicago, watching the first pale light of dawn crawl across the rooftops. I had spent most of the night wrestling with a problem I could not solve, and somewhere between exhaustion and surrender, I understood something that would follow me for the rest of my life. The world, I realized, is divided into two kinds of men. Not the rich and the poor, not the educated and the ignorant, not the fortunate and the forgotten, but those who rise before the sun, and those who are dragged out of sleep by the noise of a world already in motion. And between these two types of men, I observed over 5 decades of study, lies a gap so wide that no amount of talent, luck, or inheritance can ever fully bridge it. I have spent the better part of my life interviewing the great achievers of our age. Andrew Carnegie, who first gave me the mission that became my life's work. Thomas Edison, whose laboratory never slept, but whose mind was clearest in the hours before the world awakened. Henry Ford, who built an empire from the silence of early mornings in a small Detroit workshop. John D. Rockefeller, who spoke of the dawn as if it were a cathedral. And what I found in nearly every one of the 500 men I studied was not a secret formula, not a hidden strategy, not a mysterious stroke of genius, but a habit so simple that most men dismissed it. And precisely because they dismissed it, they remained exactly where they were. They rose early, they rose deliberately, and in the quiet hours before the rest of the world had even opened its eyes, they built the invisible foundation of everything they would ever become. But the most surprising part comes only now, and I ask you to listen with the full weight of your attention, because what I am about to share is something that took me nearly 30 years to understand. The benefit of rising early was never really about the extra hours. It was never about productivity, nor about discipline, nor about some Puritan notion of virtue. The true gift of the early morning was something far more mysterious, something that touched the very mechanism by which the subconscious mind communicates with what I have called infinite intelligence. The early hour, I discovered, was a doorway, and those who learned to walk through it were not merely more successful than their contemporaries, they were operating under a different law of life altogether. Consider for a moment the peculiar condition of the human mind in the hour just after waking. I studied this state for many years, and I observed that the mind in its first conscious moments is uniquely porous, uniquely receptive, uniquely magnetic. The barrier between the conscious and the subconscious, which during the day becomes thick as a fortress wall, is at dawn thin as a silk veil. Whatever thought you plant in those first 30 minutes sinks directly into the deeper soil of your being, and there it begins to grow, quietly, relentlessly, without asking your permission. Most men have never understood this. They reach for their worries the moment they open their eyes. They reach for the news of disasters, the reports of failures, the catalog of other people's anxieties, and they feed these poisons directly into the most fertile soil their mind will know all day. And then they wonder why their ambitions crumble and their dreams seem perpetually out of reach. The man who rises early and uses that first hour wisely is not merely gaining time. He is performing an act of sacred planting. He is choosing what will grow in the garden of his mind while the rest of the world is still dreaming. He is practicing, whether he knows it or not, the principle of autosuggestion, that quiet law by which repeated thought becomes conviction, conviction becomes action, and action becomes destiny. I have watched ordinary men transform their entire financial lives through nothing more than a disciplined first hour, repeated daily, without exception, for a period of no less than 12 months. And I have watched brilliant men with every natural advantage remain in mediocrity because they surrendered that hour to sleep, to distraction, to the random noise of a mind left unguarded. What Hill observed about this subject is deeply unsettling, and I must share it with you now. Wealth, in its truest and most lasting form, is not a function of what you do during the working day. It is a function of what you think, believe, and decide in the silent hours that no one else sees. The man who begins his day in chaos, in reaction, in the noise of other people's demands, has already surrendered the most valuable real estate of his consciousness before the world has even begun. and no strategy, no skill, no stroke of opportunity can fully compensate for a mind that has been rented out to distraction before breakfast. This is why, across every field of achievement I studied, the early riser held an advantage that seemed almost supernatural to those who competed against him. Let me tell you of a man I came to know in my later years, a man who had built a considerable fortune from almost nothing. He had been, by his own admission, a failure. He had lost 2 businesses, accumulated debts that haunted his sleep, and reached that peculiar point of despair where a man begins to suspect that fate itself has conspired against him. On the advice of an older mentor, he began rising at 4:30 every morning, not to work, not to strain, not to force productivity from an exhausted body, but simply to sit in silence, to write his definite major purpose in his own handwriting, and to speak it aloud with feeling as if it had already come to pass. Within 18 months, the first fruits appeared. Within 4 years, he was wealthy beyond anything he had previously imagined. And when I asked him what had changed, he told me that nothing had changed in the outer world. What had changed was the first hour. And because the first hour had changed, the rest of the day had slowly, inevitably reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. This story, which I could multiply 100 times from the lives of the men I studied, points to a law that most of humanity has either forgotten or never known. The first hour of the day is not a neutral space. It is not simply a block of time equivalent to any other. It is a creative hour, a generative hour, an hour in which the mind, freshly risen from the mysterious territories of sleep, is still half submerged in the subconscious and therefore uniquely capable of impressing new patterns upon itself. The great achievers knew this, even if they could not always articulate it. They rose early, not because they were more virtuous, but because they had discovered, often by accident, that this was the hour in which a man could rewrite himself. Here begins the darkest game of the subconscious mind, and I want you to follow me carefully. The subconscious mind does not distinguish between what is true and what is repeatedly imagined with feeling. It accepts whatever is pressed into it with conviction, and it begins, immediately and without pause, to arrange the circumstances of a man's life in accordance with that impression. This is why autosuggestion is so powerful. This is why the definite major purpose, written down and spoken aloud in the early hours, has such extraordinary effect upon the lives of those who practice it. And this is why the man who surrenders his first hour to randomness is effectively allowing the world to program his subconscious on his behalf. Think, if you will, of the subconscious as a vast field of fertile soil. Every thought that passes through the mind is a seed falling into that soil. In the middle of the day, when the conscious mind is fully awake and on guard, many of these seeds are rejected, examined, filtered out. But in the early morning, when the guard has not yet taken his post, the soil accepts every seed indiscriminately. And here is the terrible secret that most men never discover. It is the seeds planted in these hours that determine the harvest of your life. Not the ones planted in the striving of the afternoon, not the ones planted in the exhaustion of the evening, but the ones planted at dawn, when the soul is closest to the source from which all creation flows. I remember once speaking with an old gentleman who had known Thomas Edison personally, and he described to me how Edison, in his most productive years, maintained a ritual that seemed almost eccentric to those who observed him. Edison would rise before dawn, sit in complete silence for an extended period, and simply hold in his mind the problem he wished to solve. He did not force. He did not strain. He simply held the question, clearly, calmly, with a kind of reverent expectancy, and waited for infinite intelligence to respond. And respond it did, time and time again, in ways that astonished even Edison himself. This practice is accessible to every man who is willing to rise while the world still sleeps. It is the practice of opening oneself to the sixth sense, to that faculty of mind which receives rather than generates, which listens rather than speaks, which aligns the individual will with the larger currents of creative intelligence that move through all things. The detail most people overlook is hidden right here. It is not the act of waking early that creates wealth. It is what a man chooses to do with the state of consciousness that waking early makes available to him. A man who rises at 5 in the morning only to stare at a screen, scroll through the complaints of strangers, and feed his mind the chaos of a world already tearing itself apart, that man gains nothing. He has simply extended the duration of his own subjugation. But the man who rises early and uses that hour for a deliberate act of inner construction, for writing his aims, for visualizing his desired future, for speaking his definite major purpose with faith, for communing with the silent intelligence that speaks only in silence, that man is building the architecture of a fortune that has not yet materialized, but which, by the inexorable operation of the law of thought, must eventually take physical form. I have often been asked what a man should do precisely in the first hour of his morning if he wishes to follow the path I am describing. My answer has always centered on 4 simple practices that I observed in varying forms across nearly every great achiever I studied. The first is silence, a deliberate refusal to fill the opening moments of consciousness with noise, news, or the anxieties of others. The second is written clarity, the daily practice of writing one's definite major purpose, one's aim, one's desired destination in one's own hand every single morning, without exception. The third is vocal impression, speaking that purpose aloud with feeling as if it had already been accomplished, because the subconscious responds not to words, but to the emotional charge carried by words. And the fourth is receptive stillness, a period of quiet in which the mind is neither forcing nor distracted, but simply open, like a field receiving rain, to whatever infinite intelligence may wish to impress upon it. I tell you plainly that I have seen these 4 practices, performed consistently in the first hour of the day, transform the financial destinies of men who had every reason to expect nothing from life. I have seen them restore the bankrupt. I have seen them ignite the ambitions of those who had grown cynical with age. I have seen them break poverty consciousness and install in its place the magnetic pattern of prosperity consciousness, that particular vibration of mind which draws opportunity toward it as surely as iron is drawn to the magnet. And I have seen just as clearly what happens to men who refuse to rise. These men do not fail dramatically. They fail quietly. They fail by inches over years, until one day they look up and realize that they have become, almost without noticing, the very life they once swore they would escape. Consider the modern world for a moment and tell me honestly whether it has not been engineered, almost as if by design, to rob men of their early hours. The glowing screens that steal the last moments before sleep and the first moments after waking. The endless stream of notifications designed by clever minds to capture attention at the exact moments when attention is most vulnerable. 100 years ago, a farmer in the American heartland rose with the sun because his livelihood demanded it. And in doing so, though he may not have known it, he kept intact a psychological discipline that gave him a reservoir of inner strength no modern man with all his conveniences can easily match. The loss of the early hour is, I have come to believe, one of the great silent catastrophes of our age. Modern man has lost the compass of his inner purpose, but not the need for it. He wakes in a panic, reaches for his device, and within 30 seconds has surrendered the most valuable psychological territory he possesses to forces that do not know him, do not care about him, and will not reward him. He has traded the cathedral of the early morning for the marketplace of other people's opinions, and then he wonders why his dreams feel distant, why his purpose feels unclear, why his efforts during the day seem to produce so little in proportion to the energy he expends. The answer is not hidden in any book of strategy. It is hidden in the hour he has given away without ever realizing its value. The real turning point begins here. Wealth, in the philosophy I have developed over 5 decades of study, is never accidental. It is the outward crystallization of an inward order. It is the visible form of an invisible structure that has been built, thought by thought, intention by intention, in the private chambers of a man's mind. And the building of that invisible structure is the real work of the early morning. The man who understands this ceases to view his dawn routine as a mere productivity tactic and begins to see it for what it truly is, a sacred construction, a daily architecture of the self, a patient laying of mental foundation upon which all future material success must eventually stand. I want to speak now of a paradox that I encountered again and again in my studies. The men who rose early and built fortunes did not, in most cases, rise early in order to work harder. They rose early in order to work less frantically. They rose early in order to encounter their own minds in a state of clarity before the demands of the world could scatter that clarity in 1,000 directions. There is a profound difference between the man who rises at 5 to begin grinding and the man who rises at 5 to begin thinking. The first will burn out. The second will build an empire. The early morning is not a tool for doing more. It is a temple for becoming more. And those who confuse these two purposes will never reap the deeper harvest that is available to those who understand. What the lives of great achievers have been trying to tell us for centuries is precisely this, that the outer fortune is always a reflection of an inner order, and that the inner order is most effectively cultivated in the silent, unwitnessed hours before the world demands anything of us. Andrew Carnegie, whom I knew personally, was emphatic on this point. He told me in one of our long conversations that he had never known a truly wealthy man, wealthy in the complete sense, wealthy in mind and spirit as well as in purse, who did not guard his early hours with something approaching religious devotion. The hour, Carnegie said to me, is the seedbed, and the man who surrenders the seedbed surrenders the harvest, whether or not he ever understands what he has done. Here is another truth that most men resist, and I must state it bluntly. The refusal to rise early is, in nearly every case I studied, not a physiological matter, but a psychological one. It is not that a man cannot rise. It is that some part of him does not wish to face what the early hour would require him to face, the silence, the self, the enormity of his own undeveloped potential staring back at him through the quiet. Sleep, for many men, is not merely rest. It is escape. And the alarm that they curse each morning is not the enemy of their comfort, but the herald of a destiny they have not yet found the courage to claim. The man who learns to rise early has, in that single act, declared psychological independence from the part of himself that prefers the familiarity of his present conditions to the uncertainty of his future greatness. When you rise before the world, you are not simply gaining hours. You are performing a daily ritual of self-mastery, and self-mastery is the single most valuable commodity in the human economy. The man who can command himself to rise when every fiber of his body protests has, in that moment, demonstrated a quality of will that will later command the marketplace, command the negotiation, command the great decisions upon which fortunes turn. There is a direct observable correlation between a man's ability to master the small resistances of his own body and his ability to master the larger resistances of the world. And the early morning is the daily gymnasium in which this mastery is quietly, patiently, inexorably developed. I observed in the wealthiest men of my study a particular quality of presence in the early hours that I came to recognize as the single most reliable indicator of sustained success. It was not intensity. It was not urgency. It was a kind of calm alertness, a magnetic stillness, as if they had learned to inhabit the dawn rather than merely endure it. They did not rush into their mornings. They entered them slowly, like men walking into a cathedral. And from this ceremonial quality of their first hour emerged, I believe, the poised and decisive quality that characterized every other hour of their days. There is one more dimension of this practice I must share before I close, and it concerns what I have come to call the magnetic mind. The human mind, when held in a state of sustained clarity regarding its definite major purpose, becomes a magnetic instrument. It begins to attract, by laws that I do not fully understand but have observed countless times, the people, circumstances, and opportunities that correspond to its dominant thought. This magnetism, however, requires coherence. It requires that the mind not be perpetually scattered, pulled in 1,000 directions by the accidents of daily life. And the early hour is the daily recalibration of this magnetism. Without this daily recalibration, the magnetism degrades. The mind becomes a diffused, weak signal, and the life that corresponds to a weak signal is, inevitably, a weak life. With this daily recalibration, however, something extraordinary begins to happen. The world begins to respond. Opportunities that seem to ignore you begin to appear. People who would once have walked past you begin to seek you out. Resources that seemed permanently out of reach begin to flow toward you by routes you could not have predicted. This is not magic. It is the natural operation of a magnetic mind upon a responsive reality, and it is available to any man who is willing to pay the price of the early hour every day without exception, for as long as it takes for the new pattern to become permanent in his subconscious. I have never known a man who paid this price consistently and failed to reap the harvest. And so I ask you, as I bring this reflection to a close, to consider not merely what time you rose this morning, but what you did with the consciousness that your rising made available. Did you offer it to the silence or to the noise? Did you plant in that fertile hour the seeds of the life you intend to build, or did you allow strangers to plant their seeds in your soil? Did you speak your definite major purpose aloud, with feeling, as if it had already come to pass? Or did you allow your first impressions to be written by accidents, by habits, by the careless drift of a mind that has not yet understood its own power? These questions are not rhetorical. They are the most important questions you can ask yourself, and the honesty with which you answer them will determine more than any other single factor the shape of the life that lies ahead of you. The dawn is older than our civilization, older than our religions, older than every strategy and system that men have devised for their advancement. And in all the centuries of human striving, it has never failed to reward those who met it with reverence, with purpose, and with the disciplined cultivation of their inner life. The fortune you seek in the outer world is, I assure you, already being shaped in the quality of your mornings. And when you are ready to claim that fortune in its fullness, you will find that the first step is not in the marketplace, not in the office, not in the ambitious pursuits of the daylight hours, but in the silent, sacred, sovereign hour that belongs to you alone before the world awakens and begins to ask things of you. So I leave you with a single question, and I ask you to sit with it longer than you are comfortable sitting with any question, because the longer you sit with it, the more honestly it will answer itself. When was the last time you truly met the dawn as if your destiny depended upon it? Because it did. It always has, and it always will.